Well, hello out there. I'm David Blake, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale. This is another in our almost weekly presentations of the GLC at lunch, often with our visiting fellows, sometimes with outside scholars. And we're doing this entirely on Zoom today, contrary to our normal process, and that's because of the blizzard and its aftermath in New Haven. I'm luckily for the moment in North Carolina, tuning in. I had to do talks here yesterday. Um, but we're doing this all on Zoom today for the obvious reasons, and thank you all for coming and showing up. Today's guest is our special fellow, our annual fellow from Germany, Lisa Seuberth. Seuberth.
Seuberth.
Bert, right. No TH there. I should
Right.
have known that. Um, we have an arrangement we've had now for, oh Lord, 15 to 17 years at least with the Bavarian American Institute in Munich, Germany. Um, I set that up years and years ago with former colleagues that I made in Munich when I was a Fulbright scholar there 30 some years ago. And it's been fantastic. We get a PhD student, sometimes two, uh, who come to us for 1 month fellowships, doing research here on all kinds of topics. Uh, this year's visiting fellow, Lisa, is doing her PhD in American Literary Studies at the University of Nuremberg. Um, she studies literature in the public sphere, a kind of literary sociology. Um, she's published articles on George Saunders, the American writer George Saunders, Colson Whitehead. She draws upon to study both of them and others, Herman Melville. And her topic here is truly fascinating and difficult to do because of a good deal of secrecy in the process and in the keeping of records and minutes and so forth in these organizations. But she's here studying the 21st century prize novels and the American literary system. And by that, major prizes, the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, National Book Critics Award, et cetera, et cetera. How do these institutions, these juries function and operate, and what is the place of race and slavery in this process, especially in this first quarter of the 21st century? It's a fascinating topic, Lisa, and we're delighted to have you here. You've been wonderful to have around, and I'm happy we still have you another week, a post-blizzard week. I hope that's what it is anyway. So, welcome, Lisa, and over to you, and we'll come back in 35, 40 minutes for Q&A.
All right. Thank you, David. Thank you so much for
You
the kind
bet.
introduction. And also to everyone who's joining here today on Zoom and to the entire GLC team for making this possible, also on such short notice as a Zoom-only webinar. Before I begin, I also want to take the opportunity to thank the Bavarian American Academy and the Yale Club of Germany for sponsoring and organizing this collaboration, as David said, between Bavarian universities and the GLC, because without their support, I would not be able to present today and also not to research here at Yale for the entire month. So this being said, let me share my screen with you and dive right into the topic. I hope you can see the screen. And I'd like to start by taking us back into the not so distant past that David also referenced a minute ago, the year of 2020, when the Black Lives Matter protests were increasingly gaining public attention, as I'm sure we all remember. That year also saw a lot of articles and reading lists featuring so-called anti-racist texts, some of which included The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, as you can see here, which will be the subject of today's talk. The Nickel Boys had won the Pulitzer Prize only 11 days before the murder of George Floyd and the consequent intensification of racial discussions in the US public sphere. By honoring race-critical texts and circulating anti-racist reading lists, the literary field tried to present a racially sensitive counterweight to the racial violence discussed in the US at the time. However, also within the literary field, discriminatory practices and structures direct the production, distribution, and reception process of texts as one of the multiple legacies of slavery in the US. Literary production has been restricted for Black authors in the US since the very first Black author texts appeared. Phyllis Wheatley, the first published African-American female poet, needed the approval of a jury of white men to legitimize her status as an author. And also slave narratives usually were preceded by an authenticating document of a white authority figure attesting to the value of the text. Those dynamics persist within the 21st century and have been around already before the current restrictive political measures regarding race and literature. As Stephanie Lee reports, an advanced copy of Whitehead's 2016 slavery narrative, The Underground Railroad, included a letter by the editor-in-chief addressed to the reader of the novel, stating how he is, quote, "not ashamed to say I wept at several points while reading it, and gasped and cringed and clenched my gut in those moments when Cora, our heroine, is in horrific peril." In the final publication, then, the letter was not part of the novel anymore. Lee contextualizes the letter in the tradition of authenticating documents for slave narratives in the 19th century and concludes that the document as such, as well as its disappearance, are indicative of the racial dynamics in the contemporary publishing field. So what this incident exemplarily shows is how deeply entrenched the racial stratification of the US book market still is, driving decisions about whose texts are being circulated and how they're being positioned, while at the same time, anti-racist reading lists are circulated and race-critical literature is receiving awards. James English demonstrates in his publication, The Economy of Prestige, that book prizes are major agents in the literary field that reflect and contribute to sociocultural developments like these. Accordingly, my dissertation, of which this presentation is one chapter, uses prizes as an entry point to examine the uses and contradictions of racial discourses in the US literary field within the first 2 decades of the 21st century. More precisely, I analyze selected prize-winning novels within their respective award context to disclose the tension between a new form of public racial consciousness and the racially coded mechanisms driving the novel's distribution and reception. I argue that fiction prize winners from 2000 to 2020 include an increasing number of novels that have great potential to foster racial literacy in the public sphere, which is, however, restricted by the continuous anti-Black dynamics. So this talk today seeks to show this on the example of the 2020 Pulitzer Prize winner for fiction, The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. And like my main argument, this talk will also be structured according to the 2 sides of possibility and restriction. So first, I'll show how the Nickel Boys transports racial literacy to its readers, and then how discriminatory structures restrict this potential. So what do I mean when I say racial literacy? My understanding of the concept follows Lani Guinier, who defines racial literacy broadly as, quote, "the capacity to decipher the durable racial grammar that structures racialized hierarchies and frames the narrative of our republic." She argues that racial literacy is necessary to move beyond vague liberal acknowledgments of racism and to discuss more transparently and concretely which dimensions discrimination takes in the US and how race is intertwined with power exactly. For this, she identifies 3 levels that all need to be addressed in a racially literate discussion. First, racism is not exclusively an individual behavior, but a systemic condition that has shaped US society throughout historical periods and continues to do so. Second, the systemic racism has very concrete emotional, psychological, and social effects on individuals and is not just an abstract concept without real-life consequences. And third, racial literacy also means understanding that marginalized individuals are not powerless, as the national narratives of Black victimization suggest, but they retain agency in the face of oppression. So many recent prize-winning novels, including The Nickel Boys, discuss these 3 aspects and thereby right against the black-white hierarchy in the American canonical literature, as diagnosed by Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, as well as against the white liberalism that turns to colorblind rhetoric and claims of post-racialism. I would like to note here that racial literacy is sort of an ideal state that can never be completed, because as we all know, race is complex and constantly changing. I still call the novels that I analyze racially literate to show how they contribute to this continuous development and readjustment of public discussions about race. So how does the Nickel Boys do that? And first, let me introduce the novel a little bit for those who have not read it. The Nickel Boys is an in parts historical novel, parts coming-of-age story by Colson Whitehead, published in 2019 by Doubleday. The novel uses the Bildungsroman genre to transport racial literacy, exposing the history of education for Black people in the US. The story is set in the 1960s, when segregation was officially unlawful but still practiced, and the civil rights movement gained momentum. The narrative follows the Black protagonist Elwood from his childhood in Tallahassee, Florida, into his adolescence. An idealist student inspired by Martin Luther King's speeches with prospects of going to college, Elwood is confronted with the racism in his environment when he is unjustly sent to the Nickel Academy for Boys, a segregated so-called juvenile reformatory school with abusive practices that resembles more a prison than a school. The Nickel Academy is modeled after the historical Dozier School for Boys in Florida, where hundreds of Black adolescents have either died or were tortured in a building they called the White House. Dozier only closed in 2011 after unmarked graves were discovered on the school grounds and an investigation of the institution started. The protagonist Elwood and his friend Frank Turner eventually try to escape from the Nickel Academy, which is where the 1960s plot ends. The narrative alternates between the 1960s and the 2010s, when Elwood lives in New York as an adult and business owner and plans to return to Florida to testify during an investigation of the Nickel Academy. In the end, and I'm very sorry I have to spoil this, but it's essential to know for the presentation today, it is revealed that Elwood did in fact not survive the escape from the Nickel Academy, but was killed by an overseer chasing them. The Elwood Curtis that the novel depicts in New York is in fact Frank Turner, Elwood's friend from the Academy, who has adopted his friend's identity to honor his legacy, but also to create a new life after Nickel. So the novel's racial literacy shows on multiple dimensions of the narrative. First, the novel's alternation between the 1960s and the 2010s sets both time periods side by side, illustrating how the same racist structures that have governed the 60s persist in the 2010s, just in a different form. The novel's opening pages demonstrate this nicely, as the text begins with a scene in the 21st century, when the secret graveyard on Nickel grounds is discovered, and its investigation puts a stop to the office park project that is planned for the plot of land. And the scene says, "Even in death, the boys were trouble. The secret graveyard lay on the north side of the Nickel campus. The developers of the office park had earmarked the field for a lunch plaza, with 4 water features and a concrete bandstand for the occasional event. The discovery of the bodies was an expensive complication for the real estate company. Awaiting all the clear from the environmental study, there was no telling when the whole damn place could be razed, cleared, and neatly erased from history, which everyone agreed was long overdue." Connecting the death of Black children in the 1960s and the real estate project of the 2010s, this opening scene discloses how, in both centuries, Black lives are treated as disposable and are less valued than a profitable real estate project. Setting the planned lunch plaza and entertainment amenities on the same ground where dead bodies have been buried highlights the strong contrast between the violence inflicted on the boys and the lack of public interest in their cases. The novel emphasizes the discourses circulating in the US public sphere that seek to neatly erase cases of anti-Black violence from national memory. Stating that everyone agreed about the plans to forget about the Nickel Academy and its victims after the investigation, the novel refers to an indeterminably large network of people and institutions that work together to achieve this national amnesia. The novel therefore opens by calling readers' attention to the racism in the US as a systemic issue that has defined the US as much in the 60s as it does in the 21st century, and continues to describe this argument within its temporal arrangement throughout the text. So second, the novel demonstrates the effects of systemic racism on individual lives through its deviation from the traditional Bildungsroman genre. According to Jerome Barclay, a Bildungsroman is characterized by a plot that follows a young protagonist on their way to maturity and depicts their struggle to find a place within the larger society. Following two main characters, the novel breaks with the genre's traditional focus on individualism. Merging the life stories of the two characters into one through the narrative situation so that the reader cannot really differentiate between the two, the novel illustrates how systemic anti-Black racism attempts to erase Black individuality. And this is also illustrated on the cover that you see on the slide here, where you can see that the shadows of the two boys sort of merge together into one. In addition, the surprise reveal about the protagonist's death near the end shocks the reader and thereby demonstrates how violently and abruptly systemic racism can erase Black lives. The text therefore not only informs readers about the challenges to individuality and the high probability to be killed as a Black boy in the US, but the late and sudden reveal of the identity twist also involves the reader on an emotional level, who was made to believe the protagonist was safe for most part of the novel, making therefore use of cognitive as well as affective strategies to transport its racial literacy. And third, that Black people retain agency in the face of oppression is shown by the novel very prominently through the way it avoids to depict violence. Scenes of abuse are referenced in the text, yet they are never detailed to avoid a fetishizing reading and a depiction of the Black characters as helpless victims. While the scenes depicting the harsh realities of racial violence can foster racial literacy among readers, they also risk being exploited by them to satisfy their own fears and desires, including the satisfaction of a white saviorism complex or voyeurism, for example. As Saidiya Hartman argues in Scenes of Subjection, portrayal of Black suffering in literature is defined by a, quote, complicated nexus of terror and enjoyment, end of quote, due to the commodification of the Black body and the effective economies of slavery. Scenes of Black subjection, according to Hartman, can just as well call on readers' need to feel superior to an other and turn the reader into a spectator rather than a complicit witness. Colson Whitehead once himself decried the strong public focus in the literary field on what he calls the Southern novel of Black misery, which capitalizes on this fetishization of Black suffering. The Nickel Boys resist such readings, and one example how the text does that is the story of the character Clayton. Clayton is a student who was sexually abused by one of the house fathers at Nickel, who's called Freddie Rich. The following passage here on the slide, Clayton has decided to run away after his last abuse and on his way imagines being chased by the staff of Nickel. And I'll briefly read the quote. After that last trip to Lover's Lane, Clayton was done. He pictured Freddie Rich at the head of the posse, holding a flashlight, the sun gleaming off the big buffalo belt buckle Clayton knew so well, the sight of it, the clatter of it on the concrete floor. So as you see here, the act of abuse is actually never spelled out. Only the reference to the Lover's Lane, which is what the students call the place where they are abused, and the image of the belt buckle falling to the floor are indications for what was happening to Clayton before he ran away. Focalized through Clayton's perspective, it is his own thoughts that inform the reader about the abuse instead of an external depiction. The novel paraphrases and signifies, refusing to victimize its characters, giving them the control over their own stories and the readers no opportunity to fetishize their suffering. So the Nickel Boys therefore has an inscribed potential to transport its racial literacy to its readers, which was also in parts at least realized. The Nickel Boys sparked racially literate debates about systemic racism, its effect on individuals, and Black agency in newspapers and among readers. Tim Adams from The Guardian writes, for example, Whitehead neither sentimentalizes nor exaggerates the tale that emerges. He writes with a clear-eyed calm, letting his characters, particularly Elwood, speak for themselves. And Ron Charles from the Washington Post makes a similar comment when he states, Whitehead reveals the clandestine atrocities of Nickel Academy with just enough restraint to keep us in a state of wincing dread. He's superb at creating synecdoches of pain, just as a reference to a fractured wrist chained to a tree. We know in our bones what happened to the rest of that vanished body. The novel's real focus, though, is not this relentless flow of abuse, but Elwood's reaction to it. So the reviewers interpret the calm and restrained writing style as a deliberate tool employed by the text to secure the individual character's agency, leaving them their own voice in the narration without dramatizing their trauma or offering descriptions of torture. These comments discuss publicly how important it is for narratives about anti-Black violence not to be sentimentalized or exaggerated, as has often been done when racialized suffering was commercialized. The reviews acknowledge how the Nickel Boys developed a narrative detachment to resist such exploitative uses and thereby contribute to public discussions that see the systemic character of racism in the US alongside the power that Black literature and authors have within this environment. Also on Goodreads, which is a social reading platform where readers can post their opinion about books, the public discussions about the book prove to have strengthened the reader's racial literacy. So next to multiple users stating that they did not know about the Doja School for Boys before encountering the book, one user also states how the Nickel Boys shows the political and social structures that legitimize such horrors and the wider racism and discrimination, which have never gone away and which are undeniably present in our contemporary world. The user explains this in a little more detail how the novel does that, but I shorten it here just to show how the post illustrates that reading the novel made the user reflect on the continuity and the systemic character of racism in the US. Another post states that the novel brought to life the possibilities that died, the lives destroyed and ruined, and the scars that followed the survivors the rest of their lives. So here the user highlights the effect systemic racism can have on individual lives as they are discussed in the novel in the form of lifelong trauma. And a third comment says, I had mixed feelings about the seemingly dispassionate voice that Whitehead uses to describe much of the boys' experiences. It felt like an emotionally removed telling of events that were actually quite intense. I initially gave it 4 stars because I found that approach unsettling. But Ron Charles convinced me that perhaps this approach was taken to avoid sensationalizing or glorifying the boys' pain over communicating the facts. This statement shows multiple things. First, how readers did not only discuss the novel and its contents on Goodreads, but they also provide one another with links to extensive background reading, as is done here with the link to Ron Charles's review from the Washington Post, for example. Second, the post also indicates that without the review, the reader would have interpreted the distanced tone of the narrator as a lack in literary quality. The review helped them see another possible reading, one that sees the detachment in the narration as functional for the text's navigation of its racialized environment, and therefore as a demonstration of agency. However, as a third aspect, the post also shows that there are readers who do not know about the difficulties that race-critical literature encounters and interpret the text based on their own racialized position, knowledge, habits, and biases. One user states, for example, I feel that this narrative fell short in terms of literary quality. The terrors described by Alice Walker in The Color Purple or in Beloved by the late Toni Morrison are far more vivid and terrifying than this colder treatment by Whitehead. So the user voices here their expectation for literature about racial violence to be vivid and terrifying. The colder treatment was not interpreted as a deliberate strategy necessary to navigate exploitative reading practices. So this example shows that some readers' expectations of how racial violence should be depicted can prevent them from decoding dimensions of a text that could initiate a critical reflection on racialized structures. Despite these restrictions in its reception, the novel has sparked debates about the systemic character of racism, its effect on individuals, as well as Black agency within the literary community, and has contributed to a familiarization of readers with more racially literate interpretations of texts, as well as with more background knowledge on US history, race, and literature that they can carry into their future readings. Having won one of the most prestigious prizes for fiction in the Anglophone world with the Pulitzer Prize, the novel has widely circulated nationally and internationally, and thereby also its racial literacy has received a widened audience through the prize. However, some of the prize's practices stand in tension to the critique voiced in the winning text, which raises the question which role racial literacy occupies in the prize institution itself. Book prizes like the Pulitzer Prize are complex institutions that channel different influences in their selection processes. Primarily, literary awards claim to choose their nominees according to aesthetic quality. However, according to Bourdieu, the literary field is not operating autonomously without outer interference, but in interaction with other fields and different capital flows. James English explains this more concretely, that awards are distributors of economic capital through increased sales and the award money, of cultural capital like racial literacy, and of symbolic capital in the form of prestige and public attention. By issuing mission statements and selecting texts that align with particular values and belief systems, they also position themselves and the nominees politically. Studies have taken these multidimensional operations seriously and have examined which role race has played in the selection procedures in the past. Richard So's study, Red Lane Culture, captures the domination of white authors among prize winners, including the Pulitzer Prize, for the period of post-World War II, a tendency which starts to be interrupted roughly at the end of the 70s, as we see here on the slide, more strongly in the 80s and 90s, only to return to 91% white award winners after 1999. He and other scholars argue that this brief wave in diversification is based on a multitude of different phenomena, including the canon wars, Toni Morrison's influence as an editor at Random House, conglomeration, and changes in the policies of the National Endowment for the Arts at the time. In addition to being short-lived, the mere representation of Black authors among award winners does not necessarily signal a structural change in the institutions. Dan Sinekin and Richard So both emphasize that mainly a few selected brand authors are published and recognized in the era of conglomeration, who can contribute to a public image of multiculturalism by the publisher or the award institution. Alice Cashmore argues that Blackness was commercialized for the benefit of an industry, as was a language of resistance in more general terms, that served to curate a public impression as open-minded and race-conscious. The expectations put on Black authored literature have also been highly restricted, requiring authors to match what Derby English calls the Black representational space, in which they have to write about either slavery, a narrow sense of Black identity, or experiences of racism if they want to be published, let alone win prizes. Universal literary value is often reserved for white authors, while Black authored texts are acknowledged primarily with respect to their racial commentary, and the focus of my own presentation and analysis is no exception here. While Alexander Manshall's study, Writing Backwards, detects a steady increase in racial diversity among finalists and juries in the 21st century than during the post-war period, it also shows that this development is still accompanied by a homogenization in genre for POC writers. Awards have disproportionately often shortlisted POC writers for historical novels, reducing the variety of of POC literature to one genre and continuing to define the Black representational space in highly restrictive terms. Grossman, Spohr, and Young also found that the training history of the authors introduces a racialized pattern to the award selection as well. Looking at poetry prizes from 2000 to 2018, they found that 34% of white prize-winning writers hold an MFA, while 55% of prize-winning writers of color hold an MFA. For Black writers, the number is as high as 60%, and in addition, a clear preference for Ivy League education makes itself noticeable in this group compared to white winners. This points to an implicit bias in the selection process that requires a higher level of qualification for Black authors to enter the competition. The scholars summarize these developments when they state that, quote, "Now we tell a more complicated, more nuanced story, one that features a massive increase in the production that remains mostly white, and a limited, curated version of diversity that uses a rhetoric of openness." Many literary institutions, like for example the National Book Award, have issued diversity statements over the past years, declaring themselves publicly devoted to the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Until today, the Pulitzer Prize has not published such a statement. However, the selection of winning texts in the 21st century, the rise in POC authors as winners, and occasional public commentary by prize officials position the prize as inclined toward those values. As a racially literate novel by a prominent Black author, The Nickel Boys contributes to this curated version of diversity, as Grossman, Spohr, and Young call it, and simultaneously has a transformative effect on the literary public sphere, however, within clear limits. In addition to privileging white authors in the prize competition during the post-war era, the Pulitzer also has been involved in discussions about racism in literary prizes, when newspaper articles debated if the curation of a diverse public image for the institution has been part of the winner selection in 1988. In the previous year, the National Book Award declared Larry Heinemann's Paco's Story the winner for fiction instead of Morrison's Beloved, causing a public debate about the prize's legitimacy, including a letter signed by 48 Black authors exposing the injustice of neither Morrison nor James Baldwin ever winning the prestigious award. After this public outcry, the Pulitzer Prize declared Toni Morrison's Beloved as winner the following year. While she undoubtedly deserved the prize, this interaction between the two prizes also suggests that their prestige management is part of the diversification among the winning authors as well. Similarly, Whitehead's repeated success in multiple award and fellowship competitions is a testament to his talent as a writer and simultaneously shows that he carries the status of a brand author with enough symbolic capital to benefit the Pulitzer Prize. The Times cover presenting Whitehead here as America's Storyteller in 2019 illustrates that Whitehead's prestige had been considerable already before his second Pulitzer win and positions him as a representative of the entire nation. To affiliate such an author with the Pulitzer contributes to the public image of a canonizing institution and benefits the prize's symbolic capital and legitimacy. In addition to that, by selecting the Nickel Boys as winner, the jury decision continued to adhere to the historically restrictive awarding behavior that recognizes Black authors only for historical novels about Black identity or the legacies of slavery. The decision also continues racialized selection practices in other respects than genre preference. While Whitehead does not have an MFA degree, he did graduate from Harvard University, therefore also fitting the implicit requirement for Black prize winners to be highly educated, preferably with an Ivy League education. Public information about the selection process by the Pulitzer Prize is kept very scarce, maintaining the myth of aesthetic autonomy for the prize. Since the Pulitzer does not operate with a short and a long list for its fiction nominees, as for example the National Book Award does, only 3 finalists are made public during the winner announcement, which in the year of 2020 took place on the 4th of May. Next to The Nickel Boys, The Topeka School by Ben Lerner, and The Dutch House by Anne Patchett were nominated as finalists, thus two novels by successful US-American authors publicly identified as white and published by imprints of the Big Five publishers. The jury called The Nickel Boys a, quote, spare and devastating exploration of abuse at a reform school in Jim Crow-era Florida that is ultimately a powerful tale of human perseverance, dignity, and redemption. This is the only statement that is made public by the jury. The reference to the setting of Jim Crow-era Florida points out the novel's topic of racial politics and history, while its universality is highlighted when calling it a tale of human perseverance, dignity, and redemption. Though the vagueness of the formulation does not make clear that the novel is based on a historical case, it highlights both the agency and the rendering of racial violence in the text, while addressing the aesthetic quality and affective potential by calling it spare, devastating, and powerful. This phrasing does not point to a racially selective reading of the texts that either focuses exclusively on the specificity of Black experiences and Black suffering, or on the text's universal value in a colorblind fashion. Whilst brevity limits the insights to be gained for the jury's criteria, this description creates the impression that the text was not chosen exclusively for its racial content, and with this for its contribution to a racially literate appearance of the prize, but also for its aesthetic qualities and universal value. And at this point, I encourage you all to tell me in the Q&A if you read this quote somehow differently, because I'm still working on the interpretation here. So the winner selection of 2020 therefore creates a complex picture that depicts the Pulitzer's decision as aesthetically and ethically motivated while continuing racially coded selection patterns. In conclusion, The Nickel Boys is one example for how racially literate prize winners manage to foster racial literacy among readers and in the public sphere, which is both enabled and restricted by a stratified literary field that celebrates racial literacy and diversity in a carefully curated way. Nevertheless, it remains important to nominate texts like these for prestigious prizes to widen their reach and to diminish the gap between public communication and the structural dynamics in the literary field. And with that, I leave you with my works cited in case anyone wants to look up one of the sources. And I thank you so much for your attention.
Lisa, thank you so much. While we welcome questions from everyone out there in the universe of Zoom, please send them in. Michelle will be steadily curating. But I'll start with a question and a comment. First of all, I'm torn about this, only in the sense that I have served on the juries of the National Book Award, Pulitzer, Bancroft Prize, etc. And I think you really have a powerful argument here about a racialized process and where it breaks and where it is sustained. I also have enormous sympathy for people who serve on these juries because they're extremely, extremely hard choices and decisions to make. I wonder how you think now with the research you've done. I know you're not quite finished about what you have learned. This is only one question I have. What do you think you have learned about the politics of prizes, racial politics of prizes, and what do you think you've learned about the efforts of these prize organizations to stop blunt the politics, hold back the politics, erode it, to create whatever you want to call it, structures that make it possible to avoid this sort of thing. You've also raised this complicated issue about Black writers, especially fiction, and poets, that they are now, well, often universally expected to write about Black life, Black culture, that provide access to Black culture. Uh, but sometimes they want to write about whatever we might call universal, or especially poets. Poets venture in and out of their ethnic or racial identity in poetry. They just do. Some days they write about flowers. I mean, like anyone else. Um, so, and then, sorry for so many questions. Maybe you're writing this down, but
I do.
the audience, I wonder if the audience needs a little more help with the meaning of this. And you gave us a three-part definition, but the meaning of this idea of racial literacy.
Mhm.
You used Lonnie Guinier and so on. Just exactly what does that mean? And
Mhm.
it may have different meanings for different generations now. I don't know. So there's a whole bundle of questions. You can start anywhere you want. This is a fascinating problem and topic, and sometimes I feel like I've been a little too close to this.
No worries. Thank
No,
you
no, go,
for.
go ahead, and then we've got questions coming in from outside too.
All
Go ahead.
right. Well, thank you, first of all, for bringing up these multiple issues that I continuously think about, of course. And I realize that serving on this jury is an incredible task and an impossible task, basically, because you have so many different selections and there are so many
Yeah.
different aspects to consider. And also, the point of my project is not really to point the finger at any individuals and say,
Mhm.
look at this jury, look at what they did. That's not the point. The point is to make visible how systemic structures are
Yeah.
still maintained by people who do not necessarily want to maintain them, right?
Right. Right.
Because, and this sort of goes also into your second question, what do these institutions do to sort of stop those racial politics continuing? And well, as you said in your introduction, they're not very transparent about the whole internal mechanisms, but as far as I can see, um, there has not been a lot of systemic changes that would actively resist race playing a role within the selection processes as it does right now.
Yeah.
So it's not a lack of awarding important authors, and it's also not a lack of reflecting about race within the selection procedure, I feel, but a lack of really implementing concrete measures within the process that is already in place.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
and that has not been done yet. I'm not sure if it will ever be done.
Yeah.
But I think it's still important to come back to these processes and review them and see where they actually continue racialized dynamics, and because those are the points where intervention could happen, right?
Yeah.
But so far, at least as I've seen, maybe somebody from the Pulitzer Committee or whatever will
Mhm.
write me an email after this and teach me what they have been done in the past. But from the public material that is accessible, there's not so much to see. And concerning the aspect of racial literacy, um, I went for, I had a very different take on my project before. Also concerning what I learned from the project, I went in, I wanted to show how diverse everything became and how this shows a sort of progress. But then as the more I researched, the more I saw how it is more complicated than that and how racial structures are still continuing to be to play a
Yeah.
role in those processes. So I found the concept of racial literacy because I found it super helpful to differentiate between, well, this enormous public presence of race at some point, especially in 2020, when sort of racial dynamics were discussed in the public very prominently.
Yeah.
And everybody was critical about it, and everybody wanted to position him or herself as against racism at all costs. And then nothing happened, or nothing substantial happened in the long run. So, um, racial literacy provided me with a framework to explain that. Lani Grenier sets it in the context of white liberalism after the civil rights movement, when
Hmm.
actually people were pretty helpful during the civil rights movement that things were changing and then they didn't, or not in as substantial way as people hoped.
Hmm.
So. But
Hmm.
still, this white liberal American was presented in public as the desirable anti-racist person, the
Yeah.
prototype, so to speak. So this narrative continued, and the structural changes didn't happen still. So I wanted to have a concept that shows this double
Mm,
dynamic, what happens in public and what happens behind closed doors, oftentimes. And also often what happens within public, but is not as visibly inscribed
mhm.
within racial dynamics as we might think. So there is really a desire in my project to show we're all implicated within those structures. So there's no point in claiming I'm not within or a part of the system.
Yeah.
And to show, well, we might as well just talk transparently about it,
Mhm.
because that's the only way that th things could move into a different direction, in my opinion.
Yeah, this is a complicated story. Emily Grable, another of our fellows, has asked here, you probably see the question. Kind of the first part of her question, I guess, is sort of what I asked, but the second part's very interesting. Have you looked at other prizes elsewhere, say the Booker Prize, for example, or there are now uh, sort of world prizes for fiction and nonfiction and so on. Have you? Does the Booker Prize have a history here that is comparative in some ways? I don't know.
Absolutely. Thank you, Emily, for the question. And I'm glad you joined in. Emily is usually here with me in the office, so I'm
That's
glad she's
great.
here. So yeah, in my project, I look at the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the Booker Prize.
Oh, you
So
do.
I
That's
actually
right. Booker's part
have
of
this
this. That's right. Yeah.
in
Right.
my setup already. And
Mm,
the Booker Prize is interesting in multiple ways because, first of all, it has been well researched on the subject, much more than
mm,
the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award so far,
mm.
which makes it easier and also more difficult to continue this research. But for the Booker Prize, because it is essentially a British award, their
Yeah.
setup is a little differently. So they opened in 2013 and effective 2014 also for US American authors, which is why they're part of my corpus.
So it
But
becomes an Anglo award, right?
yeah,
Best
yeah,
work in English or something, right?
right. So I talk about the Anglophone literary field when I approach the Booker
Hmm.
Prize.
Hmm.
But the Booker Prize has mainly been criticized in the past for its treatment of post-colonial authors and their texts because it's basically been the same dynamic as with Black authors in the US, that beginning roughly in the 1980s, a turn toward the post-colonial novel, meaning novels by authors from the former colonies that also
Hmm.
write about this experience in some sort,
Hmm. Yeah.
have been nominated, or like the number of those authors has increased during that time.
Yeah.
And people were, of course, wondering, okay, is it a systemic change now, or is it similar as during the post-war period in the US? Is this just like a wave of diversification happening?
Yeah.
And the Booker Prize also has a more complicated history regarding colonialism, because its first sponsor was also involved in colonial practices, and actually exploited workers in the Caribbean. So um, there's also a whole different systemic involvement in exploitative practices that the Booker Prize now has to work with. And they make this somehow transparent on their website. They have made efforts to sort of transparently talk about this.
Mm,
Um, but
mm.
again, public presentation is not the same as inviting systemic change. So,
Yeah.
and I look at Paul Beatty's The Sellout and George
Mm,
Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo, which are the first two US American authors winning the Booker Prize. And
mm,
I analyze them within exactly this context that I just presented them to you. And Paul Beatty also being the first African American author to win this prize, and Paul
mm,
Saunders, the only white author within my analysis, because he
mm.
writes about the same subjects that I'm
Sure.
interested in. So I'm not sure,
That's
Emily, if
cool.
that answers your question.
No, well, certainly a good effort. Has Colson Whitehead ever weighed in on these kinds of issues in interviews? Do you know? Have you tried to trace that? I mean, most authors, especially if they win prizes, don't normally want to talk about it. But has he ever weighed in? He's a two-time winner of these biggest awards, and
Well, he has,
right in succession, in fact, two books in a row, I think, wasn't it? Or um, has he ever weighed in on any of this?
well, not explicitly.
Okay.
His interviews are often, especially concerning Lincoln and the Bardo,
Yeah.
are oftentimes circulating around issues of race, of course,
Yeah,
but they have a very humanist tone. And this is part
sure.
of what I think Steven Steinberg called like the liberal retreat from race, where we talk about culture, but we don't talk about race anymore.
Yeah,
So the discussions go a little bit into that direction.
sure.
And I'm not sure if that is done on purpose or not, or if it's just like going with the culturally
Yeah,
accepted way of talking about things at the time.
sure,
But that is
sure.
what I noticed about those interviews.
Wow. Well, I'm going to push on that uh, question even a touch further, if you don't mind. Um, do you think there's a difference between how, generally speaking, uh, the literary British world, the Brits, writ large, that includes West Indian authors, Caribbean, and so on, and for that matter, German, literary approaches to these things. Do you think they are different substantially from American?
Well, that's a tough question, but I keep
Encountered that
asking
at
that
all? I
myself
mean, it's
because,
often discussed, but not
yeah.
out loud.
Well, since I contrast sort of the British and the US American field directly in my dissertation, I have more to say about that.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically the time period that I'm looking at, because this whole opening the prize up to US American authors has also been a huge public debate, and there has been like a surge of nationalism within the British public media, where
Yeah,
people were like, "No, this is our award. Please don't let Americans dominate it." So that
yeah. Can we
politics.
have an English poet winning this again, for God's sake?
Yeah, right. There are similar discursive developments going on in the US and in Britain um, when it comes to literary prizes. For the
Yeah.
German context, I think it's still different, not necessarily in terms of discriminatory practices.
Uh-huh.
Um, I haven't researched that. Maybe I should for the Bachmann Prize or whatever. Um,
Uh-huh.
But public communication, especially when it comes to racial issues, is not very strong, like
Yeah.
in Germany in
Yeah.
general, but
Yeah.
also within literary prizes. So it's not that
You don't even have the
big
same
of a
language
topic.
for race.
Sorry?
German doesn't even have the same language for race as English.
Right. We
But
have a very complicated history with the term
yeah, right,
alone,
right,
but
right.
also the translation of my project has been difficult. But
Wow. Interesting.
nevertheless, being difficult or not, you have to talk about it. So,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
just because
yeah.
we have researched the Holocaust now in quite an extensive
Oh yeah.
fashion, and there still needs to be done a lot, that doesn't mean that we don't need to consider anti-Black dynamics within Germany as well.
As Emily just pointed out here, we are thinking of the same questions, but she does raise this question about German prize committees uh, looking to Kurdish and Turkish and so on. Partly maybe because there's such a large Turkish population in Germany and so on. I don't know. Is that really a trend? That's interesting.
I have no idea about the trends in German literary
Okay.
awards, but it would be
You're an Americanist, so let's remember that.
yeah, it would be an interesting comparison though.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
imagine to find similar and different dynamics as is always, but like to see really how the complexities play out differently in the different contexts
yeah.
would be an interesting side project.
Well, and you may spawn, I don't know who else is studying this, you would know. Gosh, this gets only more interesting when you start comparing fiction awards with nonfiction awards,
Hmm.
history, sciences, and so on and so forth. There, the racial politics can be similar, but also very different.
Hmm.
Fiction, the assumption is always that fiction is so personal to the identity of a people, a writer, a culture, and so on and so forth. Whereas nonfiction is perhaps more detached and so on. And maybe it is. I don't know. There's some funny dividing lines in this issue and this question, but it's gonna go through further phases, no doubt. And one phase was perhaps launched, started, or ended. I don't know what around 2020.
Yeah, we'll see what the future holds. But
Yeah.
regarding the difference between fiction and nonfiction, of course, fiction
Yeah.
has more creative license, and that also
Oh, sure.
that makes it also more complicated because writers can also position or make claims in their fictional novels that they wouldn't necessarily do in a nonfiction novel. And it
Right.
remains ambiguous whether a character said it, whether it's the opinion
Yeah.
of the novel, or it's a critical reflection of that opinion. So there's a lot of wiggle room, a lot more than in nonfiction books.
I always wonder about those poetry juries. I mean, how do you judge? I'm sure there are criteria and there are forms and so on, but whoo, I don't, I guess
Maybe
I
they
don't
wonder the
understand.
same about fiction.
Yeah, well, they say the same about fiction, of course. Right, right. Michelle is coming on here to tell us we've probably run out of time, but
No, no, I was
oh,
going to ask a question.
oh, good, 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 good. Michelle has a question, of course.
Um, so thank you so much, Lisa. And it's funny asking a question when we're sitting in neighboring rooms here, but I'm just wondering a couple of things. It's a great project. I'm wondering, I know you brought in like Goodreads responses to the novels. I'm wondering how much you're looking at that sort of reader response
Mhm.
aspect or um, kind of just popularity,
Mhm.
trends in popularity of authors or types of fiction,
Mhm.
in a racialized way, like looking at bestseller lists and that sort of thing. And the other question is, in terms of the administration of these prizes, are you looking at how the boards and juries are composed and how that maybe has
Mhm.
changed through time?
Yes, thank you, Michelle, for the question. So the reader or the response analysis is mainly limited to Goodreads posts and big newspaper articles like the New York Times or the Guardian, because those are also major newspapers covering the awards. So it made sense for me to look at the reviews and just see, okay, how was actually the racial literacy of the novels discussed there? And for the Goodreads novels, the Goodreads posts, how did non-professional readers also respond to that? I do not consider ratings in the sense of bestsellers, for example, also because bestsellers are signs in themselves. For example, the New York Times bestseller list also is not a one-to-one reflection of sales. It's also composed somehow differently. I didn't dig deeper into that. I just
That would be a
read.
trap not worth going down, I think, the bestseller business.
Yeah, so other scholars are doing that, thank God. But for my
Yeah,
project, I have to stick to sort of the awards. Um, and I selected the newspaper articles as well as Goodreads reviews because I wanted to have a feeling not only for, okay, how are the gatekeeping institutions talking about this, but also how do quote unquote ordinary readers reflect on the issues. So, and on the issue of the board selection and the jury selection, I did not include this in the presentation today because like I have to stop at some point, but um, I do look at the jury composition.
hmm.
Notably, it's also very important for the National Book Award and the Booker Prize because there they have the highest authority in who's getting the prize. As you said, for the Pulitzer Prize, there's still the board that can sort of
A very
interject
large
there.
board, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But I'm still looking at the juries also because there's a study by Alexander Manschel and Melanie Walsh who analyzed how the composition of racial identities within a jury sort of predicts or influences who will win the award and if a POC person can actually win the award. And they found that as the racial identities represented among the juries do have an effect. For example, an only white jury, at least for the National Book Award, has only selected a white author, so there was no POC winner when was an all-white jury. And they found that as soon as POC judges made the majority of a jury, the chances for a POC winner to actually be selected were also significantly increased. So this sort of points to the social dynamics within the jury that play a decisive role for who will win. It's not like a one-to-one correlation of like the more POC we have, the more POC are shortlisted or winning. It's not
Yeah.
that easy, but you see that race also plays a role in there.
Yeah. Well, and the National Book Award, as you know now, is exclusively a decision made by the jury.
Yeah.
There is no, well, there's a board, but they don't play any role in it. Same, at least in history, same with the Bancroft Prize, but Pulitzer is a whole different game. There's layers of people.
Mhm.
It's which opens them to some perhaps concern over politics. I don't know. It's
Well, it's also a matter of quality assurance in some way to have multiple
oh yeah,
agents
oh yeah, yeah.
interviewing. So I think
And
also
people
the
serve on the Pulitzer jury for a period of years, so that they develop habits of evaluation or something.
Mhm.
By the way, we have from Gabriel Salgado, if you look especially at the last part of Gabriel's question, I think that's quite interesting. How should we think about evaluating whether a Black author's novel helps inculcate racial literacy? That's an interesting choice of verbs, while not presuming it must do so, or otherwise guarding against the trap of Black representational space you talked about. I mean, I guess that's getting at this question of the intent of the Black author or the responsibility and expectation of the Black author to do this with works of art. I don't know.
Mhm.
Any thoughts on that, especially that latter part of that question?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Thanks, Gabe, for the question. Well, it's as always, it's a complicated question. It's a complicated answer because, of
Oh
course,
yeah.
there is a necessity for fostering racial literacy among public discussions. But at the same time, it is not the responsibility of Black authors or any Black person to educate a mainly white public sphere about racism. So that
Yeah.
has also been like an issue in the past. Like Black people were sort of held responsible for explaining to white people or racially illiterate people for that matter
Mhm.
why racism is an important issue in the US. So I also refrain from talking about an education that these novels offer to
Mhm.
readers
Mhm.
because essentially that's of course the potential they have, but the word education sort of has that ring to it. It's their responsibility and they need
Right.
to do that. And I do not want to make that argument at all because
Mhm.
as important as those texts are,
Mhm.
they do not need to be written by a Black person
Mhm.
um, to educate an uneducated public, right? They can be written for personal self-expression or whatever. There are multiple reasons why you would write a book. So just as there are multiple reasons for white authors to write books, so it shouldn't be any different for Black people.
Uh, how about one last zinger here, and you probably got to answer it fairly quickly. But what has been the role of Melville in your? I mean, you kind of compare and draw upon Melville, or what? I mean,
Yeah, well, Melville
that
was
helpful for George Saunders, for example. I don't know.
yeah, I contrast or I compare Melville to contemporary fiction about race. But
Mhm.
that was not part of my project. That was sort of an article I did on the side because I
Oh,
found it
okay, okay.
interesting that sort of the same literary strategies and narratives are already written into Moby Dick that
Hmm.
are then written into George Saunders' novel, for example.
Hmm.
Because it's
Hmm.
Moby Dick has been recognized by Toni Morrison and many, many others as one of the few white-authored canonical texts that could be considered racially literate in the sense that I define it, because it also talks about how white supremacy is a system within the US, and
Right.
that was super rare during the time and still is in some respects. So that is sort of the correlation that exists there between my current research and that.
That's great. I mean, it's been said too about Mark Twain's Pudd'nhead Wilson that I mean, over the years, I've encountered people who say, "Oh no, that belongs in a Black Studies course." You know?
It does, but for multiple reasons. It's also
Yeah,
very,
yeah,
very
yeah,
complex, and you can
yeah, yeah.
argue either way there.
Right. Oh, this has been fascinated and fascinating. And again, at the GLC, we love bringing in people like you, Lisa, who not only do literature and topics other than straightforward history, uh, but make us think beyond our own borders. So again, thank you, and I hope you enjoy your last week with us. I'll be
Thanks.
back in a couple of days, so I'll see you before you leave, and we can chat some more about this labyrinthine world of how book prices are done. Would that it was a precise science. But anyway, again, thank you. Really well done. And
Thank you so much.
stay out of the
Looking forward to
snowdrift up
talk.
there, everybody. Okay. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye, everybody, and thanks for coming.